Have you ever wondered about when you should use formulas or pivot tables or power pivot? Because they all calculate numbers, but in different ways. And unfortunately, if you pick the wrong one, it's going to drive you insane as you try to force it to work. But it might never work, and therefore it will either add a lot of manual work or you'll have to rebuild from the start. Therefore, I want to save you a lot of time, and in this video we're going to look at which tool you should use when. So if you're ready, let's get started. Our goal here is simple. We have two tables, one with transactions that contains the date, the product and the value, and the other is a table of owners which contains the product and the owner of that product. All we want to do is to create a simple report by owner that shows the total value of all of their products for month and year to date. And we want to be able to select which month end date we want that report for. Yes, this should be a pretty simple test, but maybe all of the tools won't succeed. And let's start by looking at formulas. Because we're looking at what is possible rather than how to do it, we're not going to work through the formulas in detail, but we will work through them in full. In cell J3, we have the date that we want to use for our calculation. We're going to start building our formulas in cell J5, and we want to calculate the month end date. And this is just because if somebody enters a date which is not a month end date into cell J3. So in that cell, we want the EO month of J3. I'll press F4 to loop through until we lock the column reference, and then we want 0 months in the future. Fantastic, that's now done. I'll move across into K5 and press Ctrl and R to copy the formula across. They are the two end dates. Now let's calculate the start dates. For cell J6, I want the EO month of J3, but I want 1 month in the past, and then if we add 1 day, that will give us the first day of the month. So whatever date we pick, that will always calculate the first of that month. We also want to calculate the start date for our year to date. For that, we're going to use the date function. And in there, we want the year of cell J3, and we want the first month and the first day. That now gives us the dates for our period and also the year to date. Next, in cell I9, we want to calculate our list of owners. For that, I want the sort of the unique based on the owner column of the owners table. That now gives us our list, and that list is dynamic. So if we get more owners, it would update automatically. Now let's calculate the period values. First, let's get the owner for each of our transactions. In cell J9, I will use the XLOOKUP on our product column of the transactions table, and then from the owners table, we will look up the product and return the owner. That gives us the owner for each product. Now let's add our criteria. We want to know when that owner is equal to the value in cell I9. That is our first criteria, so we need to wrap brackets around that. We can now add all of our other criteria, and they also need to be within brackets. Therefore, we want to multiply where our dates are less than or equal to the end date, and also where the date is greater than or equal to the start date. And then we can multiply by the values. When we calculate that, it returns a value if it meets all of those criteria. And as we scroll down, you can see which of those records meet those conditions. Now let's wrap this inside the sum function to calculate the value for the period. So that calculates a single value. Now let's make it calculate for each of our owners in the list. For this, we're going to use the by row function. Using the names in I9, I'll press F4 to loop through and lock in the column reference, and then I'll press hash to get the spill range of all of those values. That is the range that we want to calculate our values for. Let's turn our formula into a function. So I'll add lambda, and each cell in our I9 spill range will be called owner. Then anytime we reference I9, we want to change that to the word owner. I'll close the brackets at the end, and when we calculate, that gives us the values for the period for each owner. I'll then come across to K9, and I'll press Ctrl R to copy the formula. And now we have the year-to-date values too. So what happens if we change the date in cell J3? If we go for January, the period and the year-to-date are the same, as we would expect. But if we change it to February, and then March, the values we calculate, and the year-to-date gets larger and larger. So that is formulas. Everything is dynamic and it will update when values and dates change. The only manual action is to enter the date required for the report. For this video, we are going to plot the tools on our chart. On the left, we have calculation complexity, and across the bottom, we have volume of data. Formulas can handle a high level of complexity. And even though we haven't covered it in this video, we all know that formulas struggle with large volumes of data. So this is where formulas belongs on our chart. Now this is meant to be indicative, it's not an exact measurement. Next, let's turn our attention to Power Pivot. Here we have the same data, but to get that data into Power Pivot, we load it through Power Query. To do that, I'll select a cell in the table and then click Data from Table/Range. That now loads that table into Power Query. I'll start by renaming that query to Transactions. And then I'll change the date to a date data type. And that's done. That table is now complete. Next, let's add the owners table. To do that, I'll right-click on the transactions table and select duplicate. I'll then rename that query to owners. Let's now ensure that this query is pointing to the correct table. So I'll change the source and I'll change it so that it references the owners table. Now the change type step refers to our previous source. So I will delete that. And then I can select both columns and detect the data types for this data, and both of those columns are text. That now gives us our owners table. Because we're loading this into Power Pivot, we want to create a calendar table to help us perform our analysis. So I'll right-click on the Queries pane on the left, go to New Query, Other Sources, and then Blank Query. I'm going to rename this query to Calendar. Next, I'll go to View and Advanced Editor. Now, for this example, I already have my calendar query prepared, so I will copy that code and paste it into the Advanced Editor. It gets the earliest and latest dates from the transactions table and then creates a list of dates between that start and end date. After that, we convert that list into a table, and then we rename the column to Date. Then, based on that date column, we add a month-end date column. Finally, we add the date data type to the date column. I'll then click Done, and there you can see that we have a calendar table. We now need to load these three queries into Power Pivot. I'll go to Home, then I'll click on the Close and Load drop-down and select Close and Load to. We want to load this as Only Create Connection with the Add This to the Data Model option checked. It's that option which loads the data to Power Pivot. Then I'll click OK. That now loads the data and adds it to the Power Pivot data model. Let's go and create our relationships. In the Data tab, I'll click Data Model and then Manage Data Model. If you haven't enabled Power Pivot previously, you will be asked if you want to. Just click OK. This now loads the Power Pivot tool, and we want to go to the diagram view. We can see each of our tables. We're going to drag transactions to the bottom and then create the relationships. I'll drag product to the product field of the owners table, and I'll drag date to the date field of the calendar table. And that creates all of our relationships. So I'll close the Power Pivot window and return back to Excel. Let's now create a pivot table output, but using the Power Pivot calculation engine. I'll click Insert. Then from the Pivot Table drop-down, I'll select From Data Model. And we want to create this pivot table on the existing worksheet. I'll click OK. Let's add the fields to our pivot table areas. Now we only want to add the fields which are contained in tables which have the small orange icon in the corner. That indicates that these are tables that exist inside the data model. I'm going to select Owner from the Owners table and then drag that into the Rows area. Next, let's add a slicer so we can select the different time periods. I'll click Insert Slicer. We've not used the calendar table inside our pivot table, so we need to click All, and then we can select End of Month from the calendar table. When we click OK, that now creates a slicer, and I will select March and place that next to the pivot table. Now let's create our calculations, or measures as they are known in Power Pivot. In the Power Pivot ribbon, I'm going to select Measures and then New Measure. I'll call our new measure Period, and then I'll enter the formula, which will be the sum of, from the Transactions table, we want the Values column. Then I'll click OK. That now adds that to our output, and it gives us the correct calculation for the period. Let's add another measure. This one will be called YTD for year to date, and the formula will be the calculate of the sum from our transactions table and the value column, and we want to filter this by using the dates YTD function, and then we need our calendar table and the date column. I'll click OK to accept that, and that's also added those values to our output, and it is the year-to-date calculation. If we select different months, the output changes. For January, both values are the same, as we would expect. For February and March, the values update, and the year-to-date gets larger and larger. So that is Power Pivot. It provides an output which is in the same form as a pivot table, but the calculation engine behind it is completely different, and it gives a lot of flexibility. Now, it does require some additional work to set it up the first time, but once it's there, it just keeps working. In this scenario, we've seen it can handle similar complexity to formulas. However, in other scenarios, it isn't quite as flexible. But Power Pivot is specifically designed to work with large data sets. Therefore, it belongs here on our chart. Finally, let's turn our attention to pivot tables. Once again, we have the same data, but for pivot tables, we have to load from a single source. That source can be via the grid, as we're using in this example, or via Power Query and other external connections. Either way, the concepts and issues are the same. Let's start by creating our pivot table. I'll select a cell in the table and click Insert Pivot Table. We want that on the existing worksheet in cell I4, and I'll click OK. That creates the pivot table. Let's now add some fields. We have date, product and value available, but we don't have owner. So let's start by just using product, which I'll add into the row section, and also value, which I'll add into the value section, and that will default to a sum calculation. Now, this isn't the view that we want. We want it analysed by owner. But the only way to include owner and also month-end date is if we add those values directly into the source table. By doing this, it will add redundant data because we know the owner of delta, for example, is always win. But now we have to add that value for every row. But if we want to work with pivot tables, this is what we need to do. We're going to add 2 columns. The first is for owners. And in there, we want to use the XLOOKUP of the product. We want to look that up from the product column of the owners table, and we want to return the value of owner from that same owners table. That is the first column that we've added. Now for the second column, and this column is called end of month. In there, we want the EO month function based on the date, and we want 0 months in the future. That now calculates the date, but it's not formatted as a date. So I will select all of those values, and then using my formatting add-in, I can change that to dates, but you can also use the standard method. I'll then select the pivot table, right-click and refresh the data. This now adds the new columns of owner and end of month. So let's remove product from our pivot table and let's add owner, and that's now the right layout. We can also now add our slicer. From Pivot Table Analyze, I'll select Insert Slicer, and we want the slicer for the end of month. I'll then click OK. That now creates our slicer, and we're going to start by selecting March. For the period, that gives us the correct values. Now let's add our year to date. And this is where things start to fall apart. Because how are we going to add year to date? Let's drag in our values again, and let's take a look at what's available. This list includes basic aggregations. None of them are what we need. If we go to Show Value As, we get a different list of options. And none of those are what we need either. The closest we have is Running Total In, and we can say that we want that based on a date. I'll click OK, but unfortunately that displays as #NA. It can't calculate the value. If we change the dates, the periods continue to work, but we can't calculate year to date. Even if we go to Pivot Table Analyze and then Fields, Items and Sets, if we look in Calculated Fields, it lets us sum across fields, but not within fields. That means we can't calculate year to date inside a pivot table using only the owners as the grouping. We can with formulas and we can with Power Pivot. So it doesn't seem like it should be that difficult, but that's just not how pivot tables were designed. So what can we say about pivot tables? They can be manipulated for basic calculations, but that's all. The problem is that they have a rigid context, which means they can only perform simple calculations. However, pivot tables calculate at reasonable speed when using higher levels of data. And if we load the data via Power Query, then we can even handle more than the 1 million row limit in Excel. So this is where we've placed pivot tables on the chart. We've looked at 3 options, but which should you use? Well, before you even start in Excel, ask yourself about the volume of data and the complexity of calculation. Because if you start with the wrong tool, you can't just switch to another tool later. Now this calculation complexity makes sense when we think about the major calculation updates in Excel. Excel launched in 1985 with just formulas, and those formulas were very rigid. Then pivot tables were added in 1993, which introduced the ability to quickly change data into different views. But pivot tables had problems, some of which we've seen in this video. So in Excel 2013, Power Pivot became natively available. At the time, Microsoft made it only available for certain premium licenses, but it's now available in all licenses. Then in 2018, Microsoft announced a big update to the calculation engine to allow dynamic array formulas. and these became generally available in 2020. So, pivot tables are a 30-year-old technology which has been improved on twice, once with Power Pivot and once with dynamic array formulas. Therefore, many of the issues that you may be experiencing with pivot tables have already been resolved. So if you're thinking that maybe you should take a deeper look at dynamic array calculations, then you should check out our course, Dynamic Formulas Unleashed. Or maybe you're more interested in Power Pivot, in which case you should check out our Mastering Power Pivot course. Both are available inside our Excel Academy, therefore you get access to both at the same time. Just head on over to exceloffthegrid.com to find out more. Thanks for watching, I'll catch you next time.